Tuan-tuan dan puan-puan, welcome to Stratford to Subang, a podcast on Shakespeare, Malaysian drama, and Malaysian Shakespeares. For 36 years, the Instant Cafe Theatre Company has pioneered political comedy in Malaysia. But in 1991, they entranced audiences with their take on a Shakespearean comedy, A Midsummer Night's Dream. We're joined today by the production's director, Jo Kukathas. Known for her work as a political satirist, Jo co-founded ICT and is currently artistic director. Over the years, Jo has taken on multiple projects as an actor, director, and arts activist. She's currently organizing What the Elders Left Us, a festival dedicated to Malaysian theatre from the 1960s. You can register for the event via the link in the description. Before we move on, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more updates. And now, gentle mortals, wander into ICT's Midsummer Night's Dream. Jo Kukathas, thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Usually we start with some warm-up questions. So, shall we start?
Sure.
Okay. What's your favorite Shakespeare play?
This is one of those questions I can never answer. I think there are
Okay.
different plays which I like at different times, but I think the play that I've liked consistently, because maybe is one of the first plays I ever read was King Lear.
Mhm.
So Tempest was the first play I ever read, so it has a special place. And then King Lear has another special place.
Do you have a favorite Shakespeare quote?
Yes, but it's kind of an odd quote. Again, it comes from Lear, and again, it's a quote which I've come to like recently because I've been reading Lear a lot. And that's one of Lear's last lines when he says, "Pray you undo this button." And I know it's a very simple line, but just thought it just sort of says so much about what he's been through, about old age, about deciding or realizing this is when you are about to die. There's so much, I guess, sort of humanity in that simple line for a king to say.
If you had to be one character, well, you actually have been a few characters already, but if you had to inhabit or maybe choose a character either to play or to be in real life, who would you be?
One character I always wanted to play, but I'm too old to play her, is Beatrice from Much Ado. I've always liked her. And Benedict, actually. Maybe I might prefer to play Benedict than Beatrice, but either one of those two. But, again, times change and you want to play different characters because you're at a certain age. So recently when I was asked this by my friend Vic Sivalingam, who would you like to play? And I said, well, King Lear and the Fool.
And just as a follow-up, is there any character you particularly identify with?
I don't know if I identify, but I've always really liked two characters from The Tempest. One is Prospero, and the other one is Caliban. And the one who wants to be the magician, who is the magician, but it's also a bit of a fake, and the other who wants to who's been made to hide under a rock, and is full of rage. I don't know if I am that person, but I understand that person of Caliban.
Do you have a favorite Malaysian Shakespeare adaptation? And it can be one of your own, or it could be something.
I won't choose one of my own, but I do like a play that was done by Dr. Norzizi Zulkifli, Mak Yong Titi Sakti, which is her version of Midsummer Night's Dream. I really loved how she adapted that, and it was very fun, but it was also very profound, I thought.
What does the term Malaysian Shakespeare mean to you?
I think it's any adaptation which tries to adapt either form or content by putting them in, the content by putting them in a new context. Yeah.
As I was researching this, I thought we'd start with your early life, but it became quite clear to me that we couldn't talk about your life without first talking about your father,
Right.
because it's very clear that your father, K Das, had a career that in many senses mirrors how your own career has turned out. That he was, had a political background, then went to theater making and, the arts, and then eventually became kind of a dissident figure and was very close to Tunku. Could you talk about whether you had any influence, what influence he had upon you in terms of your appreciation of theater, and also whether he introduced you to Shakespeare?
Yes, well, that's where the influence came from. So actually, my father started off in English literature. He went to politics later. He actually went to study engineering under the Colombo Plan, and then realized it wasn't for him and switched his attention to literature. And he was one who introduced all of us to reading, and particularly to Shakespeare. I remember he bought Lamb's Tales of Shakespeare when we were children and used to read them to us every night. Not every night, but whatever nights he was home. So that was my first introduction through him. And that's why I think I'm so fond of King Lear, because I remember once he was having a disagreement with my older sister, and she said something to him, and then he said to her, "Oh, my Cordelia," and we're like, "Who's Cordelia?" And then he said to us, "Oh, she's Cordelia." And I said, so we said, "Well, who are we?" And he said, "Oh, Goneril and Reagan." So I said, why? And we were really little. We were like 8. I think I was 8. And then he explained to us, who was Cordelia, who was Goneril and Reagan. And we were mortified. We're like, "We're not Goneril, we're not Reagan, we're Cordelia." And he said, "No, but you just say you love me, but Cordelia doesn't say she loves me, but maybe she does love me more." And so that sort of made me want to go and find out who Leah was, and who these daughters were.
That's very interesting. And just talking about continuing that, um, your father, yes, he started out, he went into English literature, but he did also go into the foreign service though.
Yeah.
And as a
Before
result,
he was in the foreign service, he was at Film Nagara, and then he was at Radio TV Malaya,
oh yes,
writing radio plays. So his background was very literary. And then I think then he stepped sideways into politics and joined the foreign service and became a journalist.
didn't he used to produce like little films about racial harmony or something like that?
Yes, amongst other things, he had a radio show. I can't remember the name of the characters now, but in the radio show there was essentially 3 friends, best friends from 3 different racial groups, and they, their what they got up to. And of course, as you know, he was also involved in the early days of Malaysian theatre.
He
I
kind of
didn't
was,
realize how much I followed in his footsteps so much later, actually.
right.
I didn't see that. I was consciously doing it.
He was in the foreign service, and what that did amount to was you having quite a global
Yeah,
upbringing.
yes.
So you born in Malaysia, but I think a lot of people don't realize that you I don't know if you spent time in Australia based on the information I read. So you born in Malaysia, spent some time in Australia, went to boarding school in India, and then studied in the UK and then came back to Malaysia. So
Also spent some time in Hong Kong.
oh,
Went to
right.
school in Hong Kong. Actually, it was in Hong Kong that he introduced us to Shakespeare.
Oh, really? Okay, well that ties in nicely. So I was wondering, with that global perspective, how did Shakespeare fit into that?
Yeah, I suppose that's why we never really thought of Shakespeare as being a particularly English writer. Shakespeare was always a global playwright. He was my father's favorite playwright. Um, and we knew his source material came from everywhere. He borrowed stories from all around the globe himself. And so I think we've always seen him as a global character, though the English like to claim him. But yeah, and of course Shakespeare's England was such an interesting place because it was one where the English were already beginning to travel and conquer, come back with also their interest in this other brave new worlds or exotic worlds as well.
What Shakespeare productions were you exposed to, given the fact that you'd been all over the place?
Actually, not that many.
Oh,
Hadn't seen many. I mean, my it was all through reading. It was reading the plays, and maybe in school we would read some of them in class. We never performed any of them in school, I don't think, but I remember reading them as class texts. I remember especially reading Anthony and Cleopatra, because of course we did it also for O level and A level. So we did the usual Merchant of Venice and Othello, um, then Antony and Cleopatra. And I remember reading Shaw's Antony and Caesar and Cleopatra as a kind of side text to that as well. So, but I actually can't remember the first time I saw Shakespeare live, but it was in my 20s.
And how about your university education? Because you did politics and philosophy, but
Yeah.
I'm guessing you would have done some literature courses
I didn't do
alongside.
any literature courses. I
Okay.
mean, I did politics and philosophy and economics as well in my first year. And the reason I did that was because I thought I wanted to study literature. My dad said, you know what, you probably spend all your time in the literature department anyway. So why don't you study something that you'd think you wouldn't have the discipline to study otherwise? And so I thought, okay. So then we decided on politics and philosophy because I guess I was interested in that as well. And he was right. I spent a lot of my time in the English department, but I didn't attend lectures because the load was too heavy as it was. But I did join the drama club. But I'd come from a very sheltered background in a very Christian boarding school in India, so it was all a bit of a shock going to the UK and suddenly, meeting people who were very different from me, and reading plays that were very contemporary and quite full of profanity, which I never swore a day in my life before that. So it was a new experience, and I'd done a lot of theatre before that in school. My cousins and we had a little theatre company when we were children and used to put on plays. But at university, I did it a little bit, and then I felt very I didn't feel connected to it. Yeah, and maybe also as a philosophy student, you're spending too much time sort of alone in your room being moody. So
Right.
time with theatre.
Thinking about things.
Thinking about things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your father had been involved in kind of revolutionizing the theater together with Said Alwi,
Yeah.
and kind of breaking away really from the Western canon
Yeah.
of literature. At the same time, he wrote a play called All the Perfumes.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about, could you give us a little bit of a background
Yeah.
as to his role in the theater, in
Yeah.
localizing that at the same time his experience with Shakespeare?
Well, as I said, my dad was a Shakespeare-phile, and he did love George Bernard Shaw as well, and Ibsen and Chekhov, but particularly Shakespeare, I think. And but yes, post-independence, he and Said Alwi, they were best friends, and the other friends who were on the fringes of the Malaysian Arts Theatre group decided post-independence that they should be in charge of the Malaysian Arts Theatre group since now we were independent. So they got their friends to come to the AGM and vote for them, and they got voted in. And they campaigned on a platform called No More Shakespeare, No More Shaw. And that was very interesting because, of course, they loved it, but they felt it was time to hear their own stories. So they got voted in, and Said became, I think, president or chairman, and my dad became treasurer. And at the end of the AGM, Said turned to my dad and said, "Well, Das, you got to go home and write a play." So that was his commission. So he went back and he wrote a play. Actually, the play is about communism. It was about the emergency.
Wow.
But he couldn't get away from his love of Shakespeare. And I think, I'm Instant Cafe is doing a festival later this year called What the Elders Left Us, to look at kind of our theatre of the 1960s, but also to think about, well, what do we get left? We don't just get left with our own local traditions. We're part of a global universe, right? And our traditions come from there as well. So my dad couldn't help but have, and I think it was an honest nod to that he deliberately then called it All the Perfumes. Yeah. So, I mean, Shakespeare was in his blood, let's say.
You entered the theater scene more or less at the end, toward the end of that process. There'd been plays like, K.S. Maniam's The Chord, there'd been Keaton Chai's 1984. And then you come in and you do, different roles. And your first Shakespeare role, as far as I know, was in Romeo and Juliet for the Liberal Arts Society in 1989, where you played Romeo's best friend, Mercutio. What were your first experiences acting Shakespeare in that? context, was there any effort to localize the production, or was this done very traditionally?
This is how actually I met Andrew Leslie, who then became one of the co-directors of Instant Cafe. So Andrew directed the play, and he directed it because he had studied Shakespeare, he had studied theatre at university. So myself, Andrew Leslie, Jit Murad, Sahim Al-Bakri, that's how we all met on that production. It never occurred to me that I had never acted in a production of Shakespeare. I didn't feel intimidated at the idea of going to audition for Shakespeare. And I actually, to this day, I tell actors, I think it's easier to act in Shakespeare than it is to act in many contemporary plays. Because with Shakespeare, so much about the character is given to you. If you pay attention to the punctuation, you find your character, you find your rhythm, and you find out how to say it. Whereas in a lot of contemporary work, which is perhaps not as well written, you really have to excavate a lot more and add yourself to things. Whereas I think with Shakespeare, there's so much inside the word, there's so much inside the text, there's so much inside the rhythms of everything. Actually, it's only when you say to me now that I realize, oh, that was the first time I ever acted in a Shakespeare play. I mean, outside school, yeah. But it felt very normal, it felt very natural. There wasn't an attempt particularly to localize it, but I guess we were all local actors. We all had, as you find in Malaysia, all had our own different accents depending on, where we came from in the peninsula or East Malaysia, and depending where we had gone to school. This was already Malaysian for me because everybody brought their own ways of speaking Shakespeare. But it was done contemporary, meaning modern dress, and it was done with disregard or certain regard for gender. So, for example, I played Mercutio, which is traditionally a male role. The nurse was played by Iqbal Rahim, who is a guy. So, there was, people were very shocked at the time by that. Oh, gender bending, I think people said, but it felt very natural as well. Yeah.
And your friend Anne James played Tybalt.
That's right, yes.
And killed you on stage.
She killed me on stage. It's not the first time that I've had to fight with Anne James on stage. when I did, yeah. Oh no, sorry, no, she didn't kill me. Sorry, she killed my husband, Macbeth, as well. I think. Yes, I still remember the play with her because we used as daggers. Andrew had decided to use car antennas because they were extendable. So we all had these little daggers in our belts, which were basically car antennas. And when we wanted to fight, we just extended them and then we used them like rapiers. And so Anne had pulled out her car antenna, she was fighting me, and then it broke. And without missing a beat in the rhythm of the play or the text, she just yelled out sword. And somebody in the ensemble threw her their car antenna, and she carried on the fight. She's incredible.
That's incredible. You mentioned the fact that your core group that later became Instant Cafe Theatre was all part of that production. And that actually you founded Instant Cafe that same year. Could you talk a little bit about the motivations for founding Instant Cafe Theatre?
We became friends because of Romeo and Juliet, and we talked during rehearsals and after rehearsals about the kind of theatre we wanted to do, and then Narelle McMurtry, who ran a restaurant called Bonton, was having lunch with Andrew and said to Andrew, "Oh, you're doing theatre, aren't you? We have a space upstairs which is never used at night. Would you like to use it for your theatre?" So he called myself and Zahim and Jit and said, "Hey, somebody's given us this opportunity. What should we do?" And so we all loved, Monty Python. We loved not the 9 o'clock news. There had just been Operation Lalang, where everybody was very scared to talk about anything. So we have been talking a lot about, comedy and how you could say things through comedy. And so we thought, well, why don't we then use that upstairs room? It was a tiny space. Maybe you could see 50, 60 people. We thought, well, let's use that upstairs room to make our own comedy. And that's how it started, because somebody gave us a space. We called a lot of our friends. We called, I think, I think 20 to 30 people came for various meetings that we had, and the group, was like an amoeba, growing and shrinking, growing and shrinking until finally it became the group that it became. But I think the desire to do comedy came out of the fact that everybody was saying that you can't say things. Everyone was very afraid to talk about stuff. And, I think I had a very political background with my father's work. I was helping him with some of his work by, being a proofreader and very immersed in what was going on politically, and also very upset with what was happening in the country. And I think theatre was a way to be able to deal with those things directly.
You talked about Operasi Lalang and the fact that there was this intense political background that basically was in a sense, the catalyst for forming the company.
Yeah.
And in your different statements about ICT, you've talked about creating political theatre that, quote, everybody could swallow.
Yeah.
And thing that was something that was, quote, fast and fun and furious.
Mm.
So in light of that, why did you then decide to stage A Midsummer Night's Dream in 1991? Because that's not really, and I'm really interested to hear about this, because A Midsummer Night's Dream, first of all, for a lot of Malaysians, just Shakespeare is not seen as something fast and fun and furious or easy to swallow. But even if you look at it more generally, amid the perception of A Midsummer Night's Dream, even in the UK or elsewhere, it's not seen as a political play, at least today. Could you talk a little bit about your motivations?
Yeah. Well, so we started off by saying, let's do the political comedy, and then we built a reputation for that quite quickly. But when we formed the company, we also had talked about our manifesto. What's the company manifesto? And we talked long and hard over many weeks about this. And in the end, we decided, well, we shouldn't have a manifesto, because we should develop, we should grow as the country was growing, and we should respond to what was happening. So the idea of Instant Cafe was to respond to what was going on around us. And we wanted to begin by saying, you can talk about anything. So with doing the political comedy, it was saying, let's talk about everything under the sun. But then we also then felt that people were then beginning to label us, oh, those are the people who do comedy. Those are people who are doing political satire. And we all had come from different kind of theatre backgrounds, and we still loved other kinds of theatre. So we thought, well, we can still say things about who we are using other texts. And actually, it was Andrew's idea. He was the visionary to do Shakespeare. And he said, we've already got one audience. Let's reach out to a different audience. And let's also reach out to young people, because Shakespeare is a text that's done in school. So let's make Shakespeare fun. Because a lot of people hadn't been really doing much Shakespeare in KL. I mean, they hadn't done it for a while. And we also thought, this came up in a conversation, why don't we do outdoor plays? Malaysia's got good weather. And then there was a big discussion about, well, actually, is our weather good? There's mosquitoes, and there's, when it rains, it really rains. And but we also, well, we can get a BOMO. That's also part of Malaysian life. If you're going to do an outdoor thing, they do it for sport. So why don't we do it for theatre? And so it was an attempt to say, let's go and do something really Malaysian, actually, by doing something like this, and to make it fun. Because when we talk to people, all of us love Shakespeare, but a lot of people are like, oh no, I don't like it. It's very difficult to understand. We thought, well, it's difficult to understand because you're reading it on a page, but an actor will take it off the page and make it fun, and make it, and the director can make it visual. So we thought, let's do a production of Shakespeare that will have the outdoor experience, make it fun, make it not something you come and you go to dress comfortably, sit in an outdoor setting. And we thought Midsummer Night's Dream because it was, again, a romantic in a way, a good love story. But at the same time, Instant Cafe is very democratic. So it was the year before that, Zahim Al-Bakri had been told, you're going to direct our first play. So he directed Black Comedy. And then next year they said, okay, I think it's Jo's turn to direct. And let's do a Shakespeare, because we should do Shakespeare. And we should do it outdoor. And Jo, you go direct Shakespeare. And I remember thinking, okay, I went to the British Council Library and I borrowed every book I could find on how to direct Shakespeare. So that's when I was, read John Barton and Cecily Berry, and watched every video that the British Council had, and read every book on directing. I read Peter Brook's, case studies on his dream and other people's versions of the dream. And then I came up with a version that I had wanted to tell, which was still very, in a way, political, because it was about our history. It was looking at the dream as a dream of our past, that this is a country where time is in layers, right? We have a Hindu Buddhist past, we have a Islamic polity, but regular people go past history and politics and religion to be the mechanicals who are your ordinary folk dressed in ordinary clothes. But in fact, we put the mechanicals in black because Instant Cafe was known to always wear black and they were comedians. So we put the mechanicals in the trademark Instant Cafe black. We put the Athenians in very courtly Malay clothes, so very following adat, very, very conformist, very buttoned up, covering all the arat. And then we had the fairies dressed as Indian classical dancers, inhabiting the woods, inhabiting the forest, but they all existed at the same time. You're going back in time and you're also going back to the present, where you're just, we live in pockets, right? And we have all these things happening at the same time. And I think it was to talk about that, that we're not just one thing. We don't suddenly only have one singular identity. And I think I've always been interested in this notion of the more people try to say there's one Malaysian identity, the more I say no. We have many. We're quite multiple, because we have a long history of not just colonialism, but we have a long history of
multiple cultural influences.
Yes,
yeah.
Well,
yes.
Nicely put. Yes.
Yes, and yeah, that actually brings me to something I want to talk about, because as you say, it has that political element to it, and the context of what was happening at the time. This was just at the start of the 1990s when you started to have these. On the one hand, you had this kind of almost decadent culture that was developing, especially in KL and places like that. Excessive wealth, mega projects, a lot of spearheaded by Mahathir, obviously, we won't build one.
Also the reason why we wanted to do it at Kakosa. So
that yes.
That hill, we could see the city below us and all those things happening. And in the background, we had as our backdrop, we used the house, which we lit up to be, again, layers of time.
So what, you had the house and the city acted as a kind of borrowed background? Is that?
Anyway, you couldn't see the city from the stage so clearly, but you from the arena, if you sat on the edge of the arena and you looked down, you could see the city spread below you.
Right. Yeah. Well, it adds to that whole idea of layers of time as well, right? Because you have Kakosa Srinagara is a colonial mansion, and then on the other side you have this modernization that's taking place. A lot of, I often think of when people look at the KL skyline and they juxtapose that the Sultan Abdul Samad building with the two towers,
Yes.
Yeah.
I saw a production many years later, which I really loved, of Ninagawa's Midsummer Night's Dream. That was all set in a Zen garden. It was very magical and beautiful, and the magic was created by rice falling from above the actors. And when the rice fell, within that rice falling would appear one of the characters, for instance, the Bashir Pak. But at the very end, they opened up the back of the theatre, and it led out into after all the shenanigans, Pak carefully rakes the garden, the Zen garden, and then he opens the back of the theatre, and it's just this busy Tokyo street. And I thought, yes, it's lovely. It's a lovely, because it's a dream. It's a dream. We just we go to theatre to dream a while, and then we back to reality. And I love that about Midsummer Night's Dream, because Park comes and says, "You just watched a piece of theatre. If you liked it, applaud for us. Thank you." But life is a dream as well. Anyway,
the character of Puck often it's one of the rare instances where a minor character in Shakespeare ends up defining the production. And if you if you see usually the presentation of Puck, the casting as well as how he or she is dressed, often it can tell you a lot about the production. You cast your good friend Jit Murad as Puck. What was the reason for that?
Well, not because he was my good friend, but come on, he's a perfect Puck. he is Puck, right? The word puckish, I think, was invented to describe him in so many ways. I mean, he's naughty, nakal, he's funny, he's clever, he's always ready to disrupt as well. And he loved Shakespeare. And also that way he got to play not just Puck, but also got to play Philostrates, the major domo of the house. And so he played that opposite. Again, the idea, of course, that one is the other. In one world, you're Philostrates. In another world, when you're free, you create order in one place, and you create disorder in the other.
Well, that's interesting because I had, yeah, so you did do a certain amount of doubling then, because often what happens in A Midsummer Night's Dream is a lot of the characters in the human world are then also play the fairies.
Yes.
But I noticed that you actually had a separate cast of characters for most of them.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I did that for Titania and Oberon are usually the same actors will play Hippolyta and Theseus, but I decided against that for this production because I wanted the world of the fairies to be racially distinct as well. And I didn't, yeah, so I wanted to feel it wasn't the same actor playing the role. Yeah.
Racially distinct in what sense?
I mean, because they were being played by Indian classical performers.
Okay.
I mean, even if those Sukanya Venugopal is not an Indian classical dancer, she's done Indian classical dance, so she could bring that vocabulary into her work. And Terence Swamipillai, who played Oberon, who was a last-minute replacement for Manu Mani, who hurt his back, went to study with Sutra dance in order to learn Indian classical dance to get that kind of body language and to learn some basic Indian classical dance poses. And I wanted him to play Oberon, and Sukanya to play Titania.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Indian classical dance, and because you mentioned a little bit about different cultural influences, but the 90s is also a period when you start to see a lot of resistance to that.
Yes.
There was the so-called, I say so-called Islamization movements because people have so many different ideas about what that means. But you had basically a kind of political effort to capitalize on Islam, and in particular, UMNO and PAS were trying to outdo each other with their own version of that. And a lot of that meant rejecting the Hindu, Buddhist, and animistic influences in Malaysian culture and very specifically in Malay culture. You got Ramli Ibrahim, a famous classical Indian, well, probably the most famous classical Indian dancer in Malaysia, and his Sutra dance company to infuse the whole production with this element of classical Indian dance. Could you talk a little bit about that and if you received any pushback?
I was lucky enough to be taken to watch Ramli by my father. So while you're right in saying this is what was happening in Malaysia in the early 90s or late 80s, there were people like Ramli, creating work which showed the connections between our past and our present and our syncretic natures. There was also people like Azanin. Remember my dad taking me to watch Azanin doing like a huge Kuda Kapang, contemporary Kuda Kapang dance as well. He took me to watch Hechun from Kelantan performing Menorah. So, I was very aware of these classical or traditional forms. And I actually have always been very attracted to Malaysian classical art forms and always wanted to sort of do things to connect them. So when I saw Ramli performing and had this idea for Midsummer Night's Dream, I just, even though I was a very young, new, maybe it is that, that confidence of youth that made me think, let me ask him. And, my father had introduced him to me and he'd been very charming and very friendly. And so I messaged him and he was extremely gracious. I mean, now when I look back on it, I was so new to it all, but he treated me immediately as a fellow artist, as an equal, and I learned a great deal from him. I was really grateful for that that collaboration and the collaborative spirit he brought to it. Yeah.
We've been talking a little bit about the classical Indian dance and how you brought that element into Midsummer Night's Dream. But of course, India already actually features in a Midsummer Night's Dream if you look closely enough. There's the Indian boy, the so-called, who's called the changeling boy. And he's basically the center of the conflict between the two fairy characters, Titania and Oberon, and they're competing over who gets to keep him, basically. How did you deal with that, especially since your production already had this strong Indian element? And I noticed that in the program you call him the little mortal boy.
Yes, because it wouldn't have made sense if he had been just, if what was interesting about him was that he was an exotic creature from India, because they were exotic creatures of Indian origin as well. So we made him something that they both wanted, that they desired, to make him mortal, because that way it's like, well, they want this mortal living with them, and he as with any warring couple, he just becomes the object of their quarrel, right? Well, I want him, no, I want him. So then he becomes, like children in a divorce, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't, the thing is, you include him as an onstage character, which is sometimes done, but the fact of the matter is in the text, he really doesn't have to. You don't see him. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
He's just the point for them to quarrel over, and also for the quarrel to be really meaningless, as many of these quarrels are.
Yes.
And where it's like the two towns in Gulliver's Travels who are having this war over how to eat an egg. They can't even remember, what was the origin of their disagreement, except one thinks you should eat the egg from the thick side, and one thinks you should eat the egg from the narrow side. So that was what had started the war all those years ago. The reason for the quarrel is always ridiculous.
Well, that has a lot of parallels in Malaysian politics as well, right? As you've so effectively explored. The other character who is, of course, important to portray is Bottom. That is the character who is an aspiring, an actor who thinks really too much of himself and then is turned into a donkey and becomes the object of Titania's affections. How did you handle that? Was there anything particularly unusual that you did?
Okay, so in Malaysia we're all constrained by who we can cast in things. It's not like we have a huge number of professional actors. So what I did after holding auditions was I said to the people who I was interested in working with, I said, would you come and be part of a workshop? And from the workshop, I would then cast the characters. Even though I had a rough idea of who I wanted in what role, I thought, let's be open with this and let's figure out what is the story we're trying to tell. And there was somebody I had in mind to play Bottom, but he didn't want to do a workshop. I think he felt that he was, I don't want to say too good, but he said, no, I'm not interested in that kind of process. Either cast me or don't. So I said, okay, then I won't, because I wanted to do this process. And but there was an actor in the process who was his name was Nigel, and he was an elderly Englishman who been living in Malaysia for many years. And he was very funny in a very kind of unexpected way. And I just like the idea of Bottom being this old British guy who thought he knew how to do everything best. And Nigel was a very lovely man. He wasn't at all big-headed or anything like that, but he was very game to play this sort of, to send himself up in this way. So he'd always be the one bumbling forward saying, no, it should be done like this, he can never be quiet. He needs to be center stage. And I know, like Andrew Lessing, who played Theseus and was also a producer of the play, was very disturbed by this. He said, why do you want to cast Bottom, this old man, as Bottom? He should be a young, energetic person. I said, I know that's how he's often portrayed, but I quite like this idea of him being this sort of, somebody who stayed on, in the colonies after it had, after they had, gained independence. And he just, very much Malaysian. I have a lot of friends who are children of people who own plantations in Malaysia. I don't see them as being any less Malaysian, but they come from somewhere different, and they stay within their own kind of but he too will fall for a dream and wander in the woods and get lost and have an incredible dream and come out of it.
Yes. And in many senses that actually does mirror some of the things we're going to talk about when it comes to Merchant of Venice, because it does mirror a certain I mean the character does mirror a certain sort of snobbish attitude towards Shakespeare, that it has to be done. It's a British writer. He's a British writer. Has to be performed in a particular way. You know. Um,
But with mechanicals, for example, I really did encourage them to be a bit more Malaysian in their rhythms. We didn't change the text, but we just sort of said, well, you're the kind of everyday Malaysian, and of course the text of the mechanicals is quite different from the text spoken by the world of the fairies or the Athenians. It's a lot more prosy. So and yet Bottom has the most purple language. That's why it worked quite well that he was the only Englishman in this troupe of actors, and all the others were Malaysian. And some of them had never done any Shakespeare before at all, but they were quite wonderful because they were very raw and they were very real in the way that they spoke Shakespeare. And I said, don't try to put on any kind of voice that isn't your voice. But how would you say it? How would you speak Shakespeare? One of the actors who played, I think, who's the guy with the moon? I can't remember now. Shamsul. He's a mathematics professor.
right.
He's wonderful in the role, and he runs a theatre company in his university in Toronto now.
Yeah, and just before we move on, you were talking about the language, and it just occurred to me that there's also the issue of the songs as well.
Yeah.
And that's often, especially when it comes to Shakespearean comedies, trying to deal with the songs, it doesn't translate easily, not both the language as well as Shakespeare's original music. So how did you deal with that?
I worked with a mad Italian.
Okay.
So there was this man living in Malaysia at the time, Tommaso Cesare, who I had been to see, and I'd seen him at various gigs and shows. He played a double bass, and we had got talking one day, and I was trying to think about what the music would be for Midsummer Night's Dream. It was going to be an outdoor production. It was going to be trying to find these different worlds. So when we talked together about what the music would be, we both had an obsession with chimes and any kind of tinkling thing, whether it's an angklung or a chime made of metal or wood or whatever. So in the end, we decided that that would be our soundscape, that it would be the sound of chimes. And because, whether they are metal with a different pitch or they are deeper sounds. I remember we would drive around KL, and if we saw anybody's house which had chimes of any kind outside, we'd ring the bell and say, can we come and record your chimes? So we did that. And we also, Zarul al-Bakri went into the jungle and recorded jungle sounds for us deep at night. And so we kind of tried to combine those two different sounds. We didn't sing the text in the same way. We spoke the text, but with these sounds, or we just found the musicality of the text without turning them necessarily into songs.
I see. So when they're singing, you spotted snakes with the double tongue and all these, you just go chant it or just,
So we found what the rhythm would be, but with the sound of whatever chime sound we decided to put with it. So it was more tonal, I think, and it was trying to discover something about what was happening. A different kind of sound will open up an atmosphere. So that's what we try to do more with the sound and with the songs. We just to create a certain kind of atmosphere, because the words themselves are not important for those songs. It's to evoke a certain kind of
feeling
inside the body.
Yeah.
Chimes are so powerful in that way, because the striking of these notes on something really opens up spaces.
It was a very successful production, that really opened up the play to many people, because apparently 300 people each night, roughly 300 people, and you played for 14 straight evenings.
It was so popular. Before this, I think most people had been doing plays in KL in 3 nights maximum, and I think it was us deciding, let's just take a risk.
Exactly.
But we went to a lot of schools before that. We went and did a lot of excerpts. We really tried to get people interested in it before we staged it. And we had two secret weapons. One was Daima Bakri, one was Jit Murad, two young, handsome, charming men. And they went to a lot of schools and charmed the pants off everybody. And then everybody got to come and see them on stage.
Two very charismatic men.
Very
Also,
charismatic
yeah.
as well, yes. And wonderful actors.
Yes. Would you like to talk a little bit about your upcoming work on Lear and how that's going?
It's so interesting for me now to be looking at Lear because of my age. I'm interested in Lear in a very different way, and that's why when you ask me what's my favorite line, is that line about something with the button. Because you think about, and I remember my father when he didn't know he was ill. He was dying, but he wrote this poem when he was towards the end of his life, before he knew he had cancer. And he had brain cancer, and he wrote this poem where he says to the god of death, Lord Yama, he says, "Come and untailor me, unthread me." And when I read the poem that we found after he passed away, it was very moving to feel that he's saying, whatever's going on inside me, I don't like it, and I'm ready to go. But Yama, the god of death, says to him, "It's not your time. When it's your time, I'll come, and I will untailor you, but not yet, not now." And so when Lear says, "Unbutton my shirt," he's saying, all the kingly robes, all that I am, it's nothing. It means nothing. Take it away. I'm ready for it to go. My daughter's dead. I've lost everything. The dearest thing to me. I don't need this trappings of this body anymore. I just love that.
And also, just a thought that occurred to me, and I'd like to hear your insights on this. There is that undoing the button, but then shortly after that, he sees Cordelia as alive.
Yeah.
And I've read and says, look there, and that's the end. But and people have argued that he believes Cordelia is alive. But there is an interpretation that I found very appealing, which is that it's not that he believes Cordelia is alive, but he actually sees her, that this physical realm really isn't it. That he sees the real life beyond what, the veil of appearances.
For somebody who's known for being a comedian, I'm very interested in death. I always have.
Well, a lot of comedians do have a concern with this thing.
And I wrote a play that happened as a result of my mother's death. It was called Silence, Please, which is trying to understand the silence that overcomes you when you're in a place of grief, where you can't speak, you have no more words left. But also, I wrote another play where one of the minor characters, who was a biscuit maker from Tampa, who was a king of a factory, but how when he got old, his daughters put him in a mental asylum and then took away his biscuit factory, and he dies in this mental asylum, having taken off all his clothes, and he just lays down in the river and lets the river take him back to China. So I think, and before that, they had found him wandering the chalk limestone cliffs of Ipoh. So
it's a version of King Lear in a sense.
Version of King Lear, yeah. And I remember when I was writing, I wasn't trying to, and then as I was writing, I was like, oh, okay, these things are just part of your consciousness, and this way of seeing age and power is done so beautifully in Lear. I think that even though Lear is such an awful man in certain times, he's trying to understand. It's what theatre does for us, right? Tries to make us understand actions that we cannot understand. Try to make us kind of see more deeply into them, consequences of action and suffering, and having sympathy for that suffering that we put ourselves through. We are also all Lear in a way. We get things wrong. We make wrong judgments. We push away people who love us and who we love because we are full of evil. That I think that the more, and that's why I think when Vic asked me which Shakespeare would you want to do, which character, I said Lear and the Fool, because in a way they are the same. Right? In his moments of clarity, Lear is the fool. He sees himself for who he is, that he is, but he can't accept.
So you're playing both Lear and the Fool in a production of King Lear, or
This is what we're exploring. because we're exploring this idea of how do you tell the story of King Lear only through these two characters' points of view. We don't know. It's an experiment. It's a way to. I know, and that's the thing, right? Like my father, no more Shakespeare, no more Shaw. So I started off first works as a writing program, so I thought we really must tell our stories, and I still feel we do. But at the same time, I cannot deny that I do love Shakespeare. I just have denied myself the chance to do it very often because I always think I need to work on new Malaysian writing as well. And that is a very demanding mistress.
Thank you very much, Jo.
Thank you, Adib.